there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I am joined by my father, Sky Keith, and by Bruce Hillman. We're trading up. You and Adam are just trading spaces.
Adam is out recording an academy.
He is. He's out in Texas recording an academy. We think he'll survive.
He will.
So
He'll be all right.
You can tell by the messages you receive how much he's used to teaching a class without a camera on. So
the pictures of him getting all maked up were pretty fun too.
But so he'll survive, and then he'll be back, I'm sure, next week. But today we are going to pick another topic from Bruce's magical list of ideas. And, Bruce, I've been staring at this topic for weeks since you sent the list over because I'm interested in it and I have a lot of ideas in it, but I'm also terrified of it. I think it's one of the scariest episodes because it has a risk of offending nearly everybody.
Yeah,
depending on what you say.
I mean, I know Bruce wants to do a little preamble, bibliographical preamble, which is great, and I think we should do that. I just kind of want to say, it's like one of those old disclaimers. Everything said on this show is the opinion of the contributors, and we're not experts on this topic. I've had a lot of personal interaction with this topic, given the line of work that I was in for most of my life, having to do with working with children and young adults, and oftentimes having to or utilizing counseling help to help with major and severe problems in that age group. But at the same time, I have not that's not fair to say. I've never professionally studied the topic.
Well, let me reveal the topic. This has been a great little cliffhanger we're leaving people on. I was doing that whole thing, where you don't tell them the topic, but yeah. So the topic is Christianity compatible with? There's a couple of different ways we could say this, but I think Bruce gave me the most neutral, which is compatible with the social sciences, and then from that you can extrapolate sort of psychology, psychological therapy, etc. So is it compatible with these
sociology,
things?
anthropology, all those things.
Sociology, anthropology, yeah, sure. Yep. So, Bruce, why don't you give some background then?
Yeah, so just first, I guess, to piggyback off what Scott said, obviously we're not doctors, and a lot of the stuff that I'm going to go over, the kind of what scholars have been saying is rather critical of things like psychology and stuff, and that's not to mean that people should just like get off their medications or anything like that. See your doctor about that. So anyway, this topic is broadly known in the scholarly literature as the critique of the therapeutic. So that kind of covers a lot of what the social sciences are seeking to do, is therapeutic informal therapy, but also just like making you feel better or fit in with your life. And the one book that sort of you can't escape is The Triumph of the Therapeutic by Philip Reif. And that was written in the 66, 67. And if you look at any biography on this subject, that book's going to come up, because Reif was the one to first actually investigate and say, wait a minute, something in society has changed since Freud, and it's pretty significant. And essentially what he looked at was, he said, we have this thing called culture. And before Freud, culture was always faith-based in any culture. It was interactive with religion. And after Freud, that began to disappear. And what does that mean? What are the consequences of that? That's what Reif wanted to look at, this triumph of the therapeutic over a culture imbibed with faith. And to do that, he looked at, well, what does culture do? Like, what is the advantage of culture? And why did we need the therapeutic? And what he thought was, which is kind of interesting, is actually culture gives us meaning. But it gives us meaning because it helps us accept limits. This was the big insight that Reif had. Culture puts limits on you: how to have sex, how to be polite, what is acceptable behavior, public and privately. These are all limits that culture puts on
First
us.
use
And
of the law, as we might say theologically.
Yeah. But then he said, well, what does a therapeutic culture do? A therapeutic culture is not socially focused, it's self-focused. And because it's self-focused, the self becomes the subject. We have no, what Reif called, we have no collective commitments to something higher. Mm-hmm. We're just ourselves. And so the therapeutic, this was Reif's kind of final point, the therapeutic it offers freedom, and that's why it's seductive. You can be whatever you want to be. You can do whatever you want to do. You can write your own story. It offers freedom. But in fact, Reif said what it does is it makes you a slave to anxiety, to disconnection from others, and it raises the metaphor of disease as a compelling part of human identity. And this was also taken up later by a woman named Susan Sontag. She has a great little book. It's really tiny if you're interested in this, called Illness and Metaphors. And she talks about things like addiction as a metaphor. And why do we use disease as a metaphor to describe the human?
Did Sontag write something else too?
Yeah, she wrote a bunch
that I would know of.
things.
Okay, because I'm like, I've definitely read something by her, and I can't remember at the top of my head what it is, but the name is so familiar.
So she does that. And then a philosopher comes along, very famous philosopher in the modern times, named Alasdair MacIntyre. And he takes things a little further off of this thesis. And he says, look, you know what? Culture needs a moral foundation to be a true culture. If it doesn't have a moral foundation, it won't function as a culture. And what that means for him is that culture is geared towards a goal. Human existence, a culture is trying to achieve something morally, as well as other things. But it has a goal of what the human should be. And it's ascribing limits. He agrees with Reif on that. But what he sees happening is in the new therapeutic culture that has emerged post-Freud, we now just don't have any goal that we're striving for. It's all self-made. Here he's very aligned with Reif. Now he's going to start to do his own thing. And he said he calls this emotivism. That's how he describes the new culture, emotivism. Mm-hmm. And what he means by that is people actually don't have a culture that tells them who they should be anymore. What they have are fragments, MacIntyre says, of past moral systems that they've assembled into a like dystopian mosaic. And that's all self-made. Now, that's an interesting observation, but where his genius really starts to come in is where he goes next. He says, we now have no means in culture today, in society, to appeal to the good. We have no means to appeal to the good because we've lost any moral foundation or human goal. And what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. Here's where he gets really dark and interesting, if you like that sort of thing. All that exists now in societal debate about the good is a debate over preferences. Mm-hmm. Since we can't agree on the good, MacIntyre says we're only debating preferences. Now he goes one step further, and he says, well, what does that mean? That means that all the things you see in society today on public debate, on public policy, on politics, on arguments that people have over religion versus science, all that kind of stuff. Almost all of them are just debates over preferences, which means that the therapeutic world is an emotionally manipulative world. It's not a world of reason. We've actually left the Enlightenment project and moved into a truly postmodern project because we're no longer debating over what is true and good. We're actually debating over what we preference under the guise of truth, when in fact we've become expert emotional manipulators in the public consciousness and society. So that was his big breakthrough. Then some scholars took that, some religious scholars, and they said, oh, you know what this therapeutic is? This is new Gnosticism. It's back. Gnosticism's back. Because Gnosticism says that salvation comes through a secret knowledge. And that's what the therapeutic offers. You go to certain priests and priestesses. They're called counselors or anthropologists or sociologists, and only they have the keys to help you become a full human. one who's no longer disconnected and anxious and depressed anymore. You go to these priests and priestesses, and they have the secret knowledge that you can't attain on your own, and they will shepherd you and help you attain full humanhood. Well, this is just Gnosticism, say some of the religious scholars, and one of them is Catherine Turner. I'm getting that confused. Is it Turner or Tumblr? I don't remember now. Anyway, she uses the term mind core salvation. We're going to, it's mind salvation. All right. Two more, and then we can go wherever we want with this. Another scholar comes along, very important sociologist named James Nolan Jr. He's in Massachusetts now. Is it Williams College, I think? He does his sociological work in the criminal justice system, and he defines 5 characteristics of the therapeutic world or society. I'll read you them because I think listeners and everyone else are going to say, "Oh yeah, I see that."
Recognize.
So here are his
patterns.
5 characteristics. 1, a pronounced cultural preoccupation with the individual self. 2, a notable concern with the place of emotions in making sense of oneself and one's place in the world. 3, the emergence of a new class of counselors, psychologists, and therapists who have been socially recognized as those most qualified to guide the emotion-laden self through the complexities of modern social life. He gets that a lot from McAteer. 4, the reinterpretation of a growing number of behaviors through the pathologically determined heuristic of addiction, disorder, and dysfunction. So those are the metaphors we use to think of ourselves. And lastly, a unique cultural salience on the language of victimhood. Everyone's a victim. So he's seeing this in the criminal justice system, but of course it has wider
everywhere else.
Everywhere else. Theologically, then, there's 2 kind of last big voices that I would say very quickly is John Milbank, who I've mentioned before, so I won't say much about him. He's out of Nottingham. He's with the Radical Orthodoxy Project. He's probably the theologian that I know of at least the most, who's the most hostile to psychology and the social sciences. Very, very hostile. Mm-hmm. Because he believes as a theologian that the social sciences try to give an account of the human person without the Trinity and without the Logos, and therefore are absolutely fated to fail in their project to provide wholeness to humanity because they don't recognize the creator-creature distinction. And then after him, actually right around the same time, but disagreeing with him, skeptical of social sciences, but not quite willing to write them completely off, is Stanley Hauerwas from Duke. And Hauerwas believes essentially that what the therapeutic has done, the real damage it's done is 2 things. 1, it has bought into the postmodern idea that there is no story or narrative in one's life, and except the one that one creates. So one makes their own story. And 2, the problem with this is that Christians have bought into this. So I have a quote here from Hauerwas, which explains what he means. He says, liberalism, in its many forms and versions, presupposes that society can be organized without any narrative that is commonly held to be true. As a result, it tempts us to believe that freedom and rationality are independent of narrative. That is, that we are free to the extent that we have no story. In other words, we can make our own. Liberalism is therefore particularly pernicious to the extent that it prevents us from understanding how deeply we are captured by its account of our existence. So in other words, liberalism has a story, that is, you can make your own story, and we fail to recognize that we've actually just bought into the liberalism story of you can make your own story. And then where Hauerwas has contributed a lot to this topic is in his answer to that problem. And so he says, and I'll quote him here again, the primary social task of the church is to be itself. That is, a people who have been formed by a story that provides them with the skills for negotiating the danger of this existence, trusting in God's promise of redemption. Therefore, one can only learn how to be virtuous, to be like Jesus, by learning from others how that is done. To be like Jesus requires that I become part of a community that practices virtues, not that I copy his life point by point. Thus, to be like Jesus is to join him in the journey through which we are trained to be people of claiming citizenship in God's kingdom in a nonviolent love, a love that would overcome the powers of this world, not through coercion or force, but through the power of one man's death. So that's kind of the very quick and of a long history of philosophers and theologians and dealing with, troubled by the sort of rise of the therapeutic as the only way that people can become whole. And maybe the truth is in the middle somewhere, but generally the philosophers and theologians are highly critical of the therapeutic.
Wow.
I never like the answer from virtue ethics because
I don't either.
It distills, which is what you get out of. I always mess up his last name, the pronunciation of McIntyre.
I say both too. McIntyre. I think it's McIntyre.
Yeah, it's McIntyre. Yeah, okay. Whose book I read? Oh my gosh, it had to be
After Virtue.
Yeah, After Virtue in 2012, maybe. So more than a decade ago now.
Yeah, 11 years ago.
And really never went back to it, mostly because the problem I have with some of this, the response to this is it churns. Okay, so they usually identify the problem with a therapeutic as a new way of sort of seeking virtue, but within the therapeutic, the only virtue you seek is sort of personal contentment. And if your contentment is misaligned, then something's wrong, and we have to fix that or attempt to fix it. And so we put you in therapy of some kind so that you can work on yourself and fix this personal contentment issue, right? And that becomes really the most virtuous thing to do, is to work on yourself. You see these weird phrases, we did a show on weird phrases that I didn't understand like 5 years ago when they started to pop up.
There's a lot about this topic.
Yeah, and the weird phrases I think that I never understood kind of started with the millennials and now the Gen Z, and you'll have I don't even like I'm working on myself type thing, self-care,
me
days and things like this that,
I never heard me day. That's terrible.
All of this and sort of, it's a philosophy, what you discussed is a philosophy, right?
Yeah.
And by the time it gets to sort of the younger generations, it becomes memes, and little quippy phrases that don't mean a whole lot. Everybody needs a good therapist, this type of thing, right? And you just sort of, and it just gets to be, I mean, excuse me a little bit here, it gets to be a little puke worthy after a while. Like you get so sick of hearing people talk about working on themselves as like the highest goal, because it's never pointed outward, right? And so I get the virtue ethics response to that, saying, well, this can't be the response. But especially with the Christian virtue ethicists, my problem ends up being is the correction seems to be to distill Christianity in some way, shape, or form down to a virtue project that at least has something
similar ends, right?
Has a similar end, but at least has a possible quote unquote objective sort of grounding in it. But yet, even when you press the virtue ethicist, it always seems to me to be a very postmodern project, because they have a very hard time identifying systematically what virtue is. I remember specifically asking, because Jeff Mallinson got really into this, asking Jeff Mallinson to sort of distill this whole thing down for me to like one sentence, and I'll make his answer PG instead of what it really was. And he said, "Don't be a jerk." Right. And I always thought, okay. And this very much for the Christian virtue ethicist, Christianity gets then distilled down to don't be a jerk in a lot of ways. And this is sort of how social gospel, I think, makes its way back into the modern conversation, where you have sort of like,
or the law of love,
critical race theory making its way into Christian conversations and all of this, because the goal of being a Christian then is to not be a jerk. Well, that's also not very objective. What does that even mean? And so I have a hard time with both of these things personally. What I've found, and I'm curious what you think about this, Bruce, what I've found that's lacking throughout all of this for the people that are not content, and for the Christians that try to and so seek self-care, quote unquote, and for the Christians who try to respond to it, is the preaching of law and gospel to these people as the response. So you're not content. You're sensing something about yourself that is off and that just doesn't seem aligned with the quote unquote universe. Let me tell you what that is. This is your sin, and then all of the preaching of the law comes on, and then absolution follows on the heels of that. Now, when I say this doesn't mean that these people don't oftentimes need help figuring out, now that I'm forgiven and now that some, if not all of this burden of my sin has been absolved, how do I now sort of live a life where I can cope in society? And they need help with the tools to figure that out, which is where I think, if we're going to call it, and I guess I would call it therapy, the right kind of therapy can come in to teach people these tools. Because as I've spent now probably a decade talking about, so many people, Christians and non-Christians alike, have such a weird parenting that they've been sort of, I almost want to say, inflicted upon them throughout their life, that they grow up and they really don't have the tools to cope with just
things that happen in life.
This can be broad ranging. This can be like money management. Do
you see that as
emotional management?
That is a law gospel response?
What I see is this: if I were to say that there's
those kind of more specific things, I mean, not.
No, well, probably, but in helping these people, which I think at the end of the day is what everyone's trying to do, right? I would hope through this. I mean, if you're a non-Christian therapeutic specialist, you probably get in that field because you want to help people. And if you're a virtue ethicist theologian, you're probably trying to figure out a way that people can be better helped than in just strict godless therapy, right? And at the end of the day, there's a two-part thing to this. I mean, even as Christians, we acknowledge, especially as Lutherans, that that Christ's death and resurrection paid the price and gave the benefit to all those who have faith. But we also acknowledge that even those people that have faith still live in a life as sinners in a world that is sinful, which means that their daily life still is a struggle, right? Now, that daily life needs to be sort of lived with a daily reminder of their baptism and availing themselves of the means of grace every chance that they have, and of confession and absolution, and of God's gift in the supper, and on and on and on. But that relieves the burden from them, and this is the burden that it relieves. I know that I'm not right, and I'm scared about what that means for me ultimately, right? Okay, preaching of the law, bringing into the gospel, absolution. You've now lifted them off this burden, but they still don't know how to pay off their credit card. They still haven't been given the tools of how to deal with somebody in an interpersonal relationship when that person is mean to them or passive aggressive to them or whatever, right? They don't know how to react to that, and they often react poorly, which is where I think the therapeutic, I hate that word, but the therapeutic can come in to some degree if it's done correctly. One of my biggest struggles throughout my previous career with this has been the what used to be the big sort of way to do this was in talk therapy, sort of the classic talk therapy where you bring up everything, da, 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 da. A lot of that's been moving more to like cognitive behavioral therapy now, where people are, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like given life skills. They're taught to not filter every outward reaction they have to somebody else's behavior through their emotions, but to kind of
I think
to
CBT
look at the room.
is the most theologically aligned version of therapy out there, because CBT believes that there are truths, and that when you believe a lie, you invite pain and sorrow into your life.
It does, and
most of what is, quote, dysfunctional about the human person is that they're believing a lie. So the premise of CBT actually is, I find, very helpful.
Well, it is, and how that practically works out is that people that struggle with interpersonal relationships specifically are often taught through CBT not to rely on their own sense of what the person said or their own sort of emotional reaction to it, but to kind of, I mean, one of the classic ones is if you're in a room of 4 people and one of the persons says something that you think is offensive, look at the other 3 people to see if they thought it was offensive too, rather than sort of work on your own reaction to it and get all tooled up about it. That kind of thing can be helpful. So I don't know. I know this is what I'm doing. And I told Caleb that if we were to do this, that my response to this is less philosophical and less academic and more from my
work experience,
my 20 years of work experience with working with very, very troubled people, troubled young people specifically. And that, you know, I wouldn't call myself at all a fan of the sort of therapeutic movement. I'm not. But I do see the need for people to have help, especially, and maybe the therapeutic movement in a lot of ways caused this. But they need help learning how to deal with other people.
Yeah, I've got unless, Bruce, if you want to respond real quick, and then I have a lot of thoughts. I just wanted to say
2 things real quick. The first is I want to make a distinction between spiritual care and secular modalities of care, because the pastor usually engages in spiritual care, and we make this distinction between spiritual care and other modalities. Both can be helpful, but the pastor is trying specifically to use law and gospel and truth in their, quote, therapeutic means of helping someone. But there is also an added aspect that the pastor can bring, which just shows you how biased we are in our Western culture. I'll tell a quick little story from a friend of mine who went to Mount Athos many years ago.
Before you do that real quick, can I just say, I think that pastors can do both of this, but I don't think that all pastors can do both of this.
Completely agree. 100%.
And I think if you were to put this sort of task on all pastors, you'd be really crippling many pastors who just are not capable, very capable of the law, gospel, spiritual preaching and absolution care, but just not capable of the other side. And not
that's
trained.
Why I say spiritual care distinguishes that you might need other care as well.
And some pastors are capable of giving both, and I totally acknowledge that.
My friend went to Mount Athos where the monks are, and he went to their divine service, which started at like 3 a.m, and it was summertime. And later on, as the service was just like a 4-hour service or something, he started to feel sick. It was so hot in the church, and he went outside to get some fresh air. And one of the abbots was walking in, and he looked at him and he said, "Well, what are you doing out here?" They had met the day before. He says, "Oh, I'm sorry, Father. I'm just here because I was, hot and not feeling so well, needed to get some air." And he says, the monk looked at him and very gently said to him, "That is not why you are out here," and walked inside. So later at the lunchtime, he went up to the abbot and he was like, "What were you talking about?" And the abbot said, "You weren't in the church, not because you left the church, not because you were feeling bad and hot, but because of the devil. He tempted you out of church." Now, that story's always stuck with me because of this. We don't like to ascribe anymore demonic activity to some of the mental problems people face. But that is the scriptural view most of the time. And I'm not saying that there is a devil behind every bush, but I'm just saying what distinguishes Christian care also is saying we have an enemy who's out to ravage us. There's a great book on depression. I can't think of the guy's name. He's not a Christian, but he's a psychiatrist. And it's called The Noonday Demon, and it's taken from the book of Job. That title's taken from the book of Job because Job suffered the noonday demon. It's this metaphor for depression. And this author in the introduction says that depression is a flaw in love. And he actually says in the introduction that if you are a believer, and he's not, that God can be a huge help to this because a depressed person doesn't really remember or know or isn't capable of having love aligned in its right place. This is his thesis, and it's a well-regarded book. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize. Anyway, I just want to add, as we're talking about this, there's a spiritual dimension to this too. And to Milbank's point, that's what some of the other people are missing.
I totally agree with that. But okay, just coming in from the practical side again, right? I totally agree with that. I think there are so many things. Like, I remember, this is completely anecdotal and is going to show how bored I was sometimes as a teenager living in very hot Palmdale when it was too hot to go outside and skateboard. I remember as a teenager once watching Oprah. It was like 2 p.m. I had skateboarded.
Right after Price is Right.
I had skateboarded from like 8 a.m. to like noon, and then it got to be 105. I went swimming for an hour, and then I came inside. Okay, so this is sort of, you'd come inside again till about 5.
There's no DVR. There's no Hulu.
It would cool down again.
Was this interview Oprah or therapy Oprah at this point?
This is like OG Oprah.
Okay.
Right? But she was doing like an Oprah special on, I just had the word, anorexia. Right. And I'm watching this whole thing, and it was like a long Oprah. I remember it lasting a long time. And I remember thinking to myself at 16, very, very Christian kid still at 16, this to me looks like demon, my brain, possession is not, my brain's not working today. Sorry.
This looks like yet.
It's, I think I'm low on calories. This looks like demon possession to me. And in the meantime, I've never been able to shake that. And there are some, something that causes a person to hate themselves so much that no matter how beautiful they are or how skinny they get, they still see themselves as grotesquely overweight. And then practice various forms of self-harm to try to do something about that. And when these girls, I remember in the show, were talked to, and they saw a completely different image in the mirror than was actually there, and it looked like demon possession to me. And in the meantime,
oppression. I would just, so listeners know, there's oppression and possession.
Yeah,
they looked like they were possessed. Well, I'm sorry. This looked like demons.
I just don't want everyone thinking they're possessed. If they
no, and I agree with Bruce, especially for Christians with the promise of the indwelling Spirit.
Yeah.
The oppression would be much different. And actually, we have a lot of Lutherans in Luther a lot of talk about the oppression of the devil.
I guess I was assuming that many of these girls were
not Christian.
Yeah.
But
at the same time, in the meantime, my father-in-law struggled with depression, which culminated in suicide. And I believe that there were demon forces involved with his sort of inability, no matter how much therapy he got, to be able to come out of it. In the meantime, I've heard statistics that state that a person that once attempts suicide will, in all likelihood, one day succeed, just because they're so oppressed.
You get over the initial,
the door is open.
Try,
and it's but again, on the practical side, I don't know how you sort of win back an entire culture to say that, to go to the straight biblical model, which is Jesus running around releasing demons from people, from where we are. And that's kind of what scares me in some of this. I work with an organization that helps children who, with various forms of counseling, who have come out or are currently in horrible home situations that are causing them to behave poorly in school and to not succeed in school. And we're talking abuse of all stripes. We're talking 8-year-olds that are suicidal. We're talking horrible stuff here. And, do I think that some of that is supernatural, oppression in origin? I do. And so as part of this, they get they get and are already connected with pastors and Christian teachers. But they're also what the organization then does is sort of help them try to just cope with, even when they're doing better, the emotions of what they've gone through. And how to then sort of, how do you go on from there? You're 8 years old, you've been abused, you're suicidal. How do you go from there to a productive life as an adult? And I'm not saying that therapy is the only answer to that, and I don't think that it is.
Well, I think
I think it can be part of a sort of multi-pronged approach to helping people.
I think we also tend to we can cheapen real trauma in the cases of like these children who were abused by creating a culture and a society which identifies maybe not full mental illness, but mental problems that the therapeutic has to address for everybody, identifying everybody's trauma. That's a very popular phrase and stuff like that. We can cheapen that. And so there's a difference between a culture that has part of its religious...
Victims, seeks trauma,
this list
seeks
that Bruce gave,
identification, seeks the metaphors that Bruce was talking about. Yeah.
So...
I don't like any of that.
No. Now, so I... one of the reasons this is such a good topic is, various organizations release statistics on sort of mental health. And one of these was just circulating around the other day. I managed to find it. It is from the Mental Health America, which I guess is a really old nonprofit. I went and looked at there about them. Forbes has been quoting this data. A couple other news sources have been quoting this data. But it basically, they had a piece of research come out that says 46% of Americans meet the criteria for diagnosable mental health conditions. And that of that 46% who could, it's, roughly like 26% are diagnosed with a mental health condition. So it's a lot of people. When we talk about the people in therapy or receiving treatment, that's because it's been diagnosed, or at least they've seen a doctor for something. We're at over a quarter of all Americans in our specific context. And when we look at people who then also meet the criteria or the same symptoms as the people who are receiving medical care for this, it's closer to half of everybody in the U.S. Christians, for this reason, are sort of forced to respond to this. Now, also for this reason, I find that you are in some ways constrained to how you can respond to this by answering Bruce's question. Let's say the question of the show: is Christianity compatible with the social sciences or with this type of therapy? Because in all likelihood, family, friends, coworkers, whoever are diagnosed, receiving care, etc., you are forced to, before you even take a theological or intellectual consideration of this question, to say yes. Because you do not want to alienate, isolate, or attack the people in your life.
Unless you're John Milbank, he'll say no.
Unless you're John Milbank. The people in your life who are receiving this kind of care.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say, we have to be careful with that. And the book I read this weekend, which specifically dealt with psychoanalysis, Christianity and psychoanalysis, I had many things that I disagreed with in the book, but one of the things that was, I think, helpful and that people should realize is that the social sciences have had 100-year reign of proposing that they, like the empirical hard sciences, are a ethically and spiritually neutral endeavor.
Yeah, that's not
and
true.
That your particular therapist, as a practitioner of science, is a spiritually neutral individual. And I believe that's a huge part of the problem. Yeah. One of their suggestions was that their therapists and those receiving treatment ought to demand, just like for them, psychoanalysis was not CBT, but psychoanalysis, that the subconscious, quote unquote, of religious beliefs and practices actually be brought into the light of your therapist, so that now whether they are not a practitioner of religion or not, that the religious topics, their particular ethical view of the world, ought to be made known to you before you engage in therapy, because it might not align with yours.
Yeah,
and that
I
if
totally
you
agree
are
with that.
receiving care from somebody with a different story, a different ethic, a different spiritual perspective than you, that even though they may appear neutral, those things may be an attack against you, particularly Christians. So that now I'm a little skeptical of the whole Christian therapy thing, and maybe we can talk about that. Mostly
There's a
because
difference,
there's been
so
some abuse.
make a distinction between Christian therapy and
Christian therapists.
a counselor who is Christian.
Correct. So if I were,
And also counseling from a Christian perspective, as opposed to like trying to paste Jesus on counseling.
yeah, and I would say that part of the reason why is that the therapy and the self, I think, as Bruce sort of pointed out in the academic literature, has taken on one of these the place that spirituality used to hold in a lot of places. It's a science that does not deal with the material. We went through modernism, we went through materialism, we're in postmodernism, where those things don't reveal the only truth. And now we believe in spiritual and personal truths again. And in order to get at those, we have another science, because that's sort of the accepted place that knowledge and truth lie, or in sciences. And this time it's a social one. It's one that can go after the intangible, the non-physical. It can be what spirituality was in many ways. And Freud sort of historically has this perspective that religion was helpful for the same reasons, that it would help people cope with particular psychological events, that it would give them a father figure, that it would give them something to attach to, something to have, meaningful conversation and dialogue with that was not physical. And so, again, I think it's therapy has a strictly religious aspect. And to side with Milbank a little bit, I would say the social sciences in and of themselves are in all likelihood not compatible, as they are a different religion. They have religious presuppositions and doctrines which are not compatible with the Christian faith. They rise out of materialism. They might be post-materialist, but its greatest practitioners, its father of this in our modern world, strictly rejected God. And no matter how much it's evolved, and certainly all sorts of therapy have evolved past Freud, maybe even dramatically, they have that in the background. They do not have an origin in Christianity. They have an origin in post-Christian thought. And so, and dealing with the world post-religion in many ways. Now, does that mean I want to go as far and say that means you should never go to therapy and Christians shouldn't be therapists? As you guys were talking, there are some things that have really gone past it. Maybe CBT is a really good example of this. And again, I think you could have a Christian who is trying to give this sort of psychological care, because whether we like it or not, or whether we think the social sciences as a discipline and as a philosophy are compatible with Christianity or not, 50% of our population is potentially engaged in the need for this. Now, whether the therapeutic is the cause or not, to begin with, chicken and egg question is hard, but whatever the answer to that question is, it's here. And so
that was my big point, is that it's, I don't know. This is a difficult conversation. Now the philosophy of it isn't as hard for me. Like, I can say with you, I'm like, yeah, this arose out of materialism, sort of as a philosophical notion. It is not compatible with Christian theology.
And attempts to make it compatible, are also very. I'm skeptical of, and I
well, they
haven't
turn
liked
Christianity into something other than the death and resurrection of Christ for the sinner.
And I haven't liked the examples I've been given.
Distinction between the sort of philosophies that give rise to and undergird the different therapeutic practices and then the practices themselves. So to kind of maybe
that's good.
Make sense of what both of you are saying would be certain practices are helpful because the human person is constituted a certain way and all truth is God's truth. And the social sciences have almost accidentally, from a Christian perspective, landed on some helpful practices that put in the hands of Christian counselors or appropriate pastors or with a Christian worldview can be very helpful. CBT for me is a great example of this because CBT is a skill that you learn. Mm-hmm. You don't have to keep going back to the counselor. They're not priests and priestesses of some secret religion. Once you learn how CBT works, it's meant to be a self-help
program. It's not
like
an endless loop that you're never better and you always have to go see your therapist on Wednesday at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, and your therapist, in some of those traditional senses, when I hear stories about, like the talk therapy or the weekly, it's like they literally are your pastor and your spouse and your parent and all the other relationships you would have. I'll hear about. I tell my therapist things I wouldn't tell my husband.
That's part of the, that's weird, but especially on the parent side though, that's part of the problem. So many people have had parenting where there was only one. Father is absent. I mean, when I talk about 40 some odd % of children are going to grow up in this country without a father in the home. Okay, can you match that to the 40% of people that are depressed?
I'd be curious to download the full data sheet to see
what that is. Daycare, a lot of people, and I'm not criticizing, I know parents, cost of living. I'm just saying it's a new thing in human society that we're still figuring out about.
You said daycare, Bruce?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there... I'm not even trying to make a necessary correlation here, but I think all these things are interesting. And one of the things I do know in working with young adults is that when they would go to the counselors, is that these counselors were often just teaching them things that parents normally teach children.
And in our society of expertism, you could now have parents saying, I can't do that to I'm not an expert. I'm not
a therapist. Tell me what young people just need grit.
Yeah,
that's the word that's used a lot in the literature. They need grit.
I mean,
like the ability to deal with struggle and get through it.
They tell me what they're talking about with their counselor, and their counselor is literally just giving them the same advice I would give my kids as a parent. That you have to take responsibility for your actions. Not everything that happens to you is somebody doing, out to get you. Just kind of realigning them in a way that a parent in a sort of in my quote unquote normal world, a parent would for their children, or a grandparent would for their grandchild, or an uncle would for their niece or nephew. We've moved, but we haven't. I mean, we've got a whole group of people up here. We show up to church on Sunday and we fill the place. But society has moved. Literally. I mean, physically moved away from each other and moved away from parents sort of taking up that challenge, and it's left a void. And that void, there is a spiritual element to it. There is, in my opinion, a preaching element to it. But there is also just like a skills element to it that is I agree. Lost.
But I think that's why the answer from a lot of the theologians is virtue ethics, because and I have my problems with the virtue ethics answer, but I'm not willing to completely throw it out. I share the fear that it'll distill Christianity down to non-essentials, but I think the reason why it is often the common answer is because once you say, and I'll just put it kind of bluntly, there's a right way to parent. There's right things to teach your kids and wrong things to teach your kids. There's things that you, as a parent, you can neglect teaching them the right things, and you can give them the right things. Well, you've just introduced virtue, whether you like it or not, because you've said there's a goal to human life, to human ethics.
Oh, I wrote a book about this. So I know what you're talking about.
And so, like Hauerwas will say, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give unto you: you love one another."
Yeah.
And the thing is, well, then how do I love one another? How does the church, first as a corporate entity, opposite of in but not of the world, love its neighbors, and then also how do I, as an individual, love his neighbors? Well, that's a moral question, right? It's not. That's an ethical question. We're already saved in Christ. We have justification. Now it's how do we live this out and love my neighbor?
It's a neighbor question.
it's the neighbor question, but Hauerwas is pointing out, I think, but there's a right answer to that, and there's wrong answers to that.
There are, and I've always landed on sort of the divine decree answer.
The Decalogue.
The Decalogue answer.
I guess that's the...
and that sounds kind of silly, but at the end of the day, it's there. And often my problem with I think on the positive side, distilling virtue ethics down to don't be a jerk is love your neighbor as yourself. So it's distilling the Decalogue down as Christ did. And so I'm okay with that, but in society, that gets to be a little. I would actually rather just say the Decalogue.
Yeah, because I think
that
in
makes
society,
sense. I'd rather just say the Ten Commandments.
It makes sense, but I don't know that it's helpful practically. Because here's the thing: what does it mean to love my neighbor? Does it mean I have to go to the gay wedding of my son? Does it mean that I have to allow them to get prescriptions that I don't feel are safe? Does it mean all those questions are tied up with how I love?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, like whether or not you go to your gay neighbor's wedding is not the question that is actually crippling society. It's much more basic than that. When we're in a society where many people feel like they can tell their therapist things they wouldn't tell their spouse, it's like there's a deeper issue here than sort of anything that touches LGBT stuff.
Well, I think you'd have a hard time making...
The deeper issue is a theology of glory that is...
Yes.
Well, I was going to say, you're going to have a hard time making this without, I think, a catechetical life and theology. Like, to me, a lot of this comes from first-order gifts.
Right.
If we look at the creed, like I look at the creed, and if it's God giving me spouse and children, and that He does so for my ends, a good ends for me and a good ends for them, as given in the explanation of the commandments, that both the spouse and the children are for my benefit, and I am the provide for their benefit. There's a dependence and a dependent relationship between human beings, but that relationship is given by God, and without that, it's I think an uncorrectable issue until the divine who loves you and has died for you and has redeemed you and all those other people has also given those other people and yourself value in those relationships. That will always come back to self. It will always come back to, these people I want to be around. Are these people who are accepting me? Are these people who are finding some sort of value? Until the value that me and my neighbor have are outside of myself and into a decree of righteousness and a decree of goodness from God, this is very difficult.
That's why the teaching of the Decalogue is so brilliant, because, in our way of numbering, the first 3 are spent acknowledging that you're going to have a misalignment because of your sin when it comes to God, and the first 3 are spent realigning you to that, right? Then the last 7 are an acknowledgement that because of your sin, you're going to have a misalignment with how you deal with other people, and so the last 7 are spent with a realignment of that. And that's why the answer to what are the specifics, it's not a philosophical answer, other than it's sort of a divine decree answer, where here it is.
But if you don't go to your gay son's wedding, that may ruin your relationship with your son. So for these people, it is their whole issue for their whole life. It affects everything.
I agree. I just wish that were like the hardest problem.
But I think, to Caleb's point, and I agree with everything you said, Caleb, but what I wouldn't want people to think, what we're saying is that, if you're a Christian, you should be empowered to not suffer as, mental health issues as much. We're not saying that.
No, I'm saying the answer is in large part also spiritual. Like that the therapy without the creed is going to, and first order gifts and vocation is going to just lead you back to having to go back and back and back.
Which is maybe why you shouldn't discount out of hand something like the idea of Christian counseling, because it's been so misused. And say, that a Christian who's got that right alignment that you just talked about, who also is a counselor doing something like, or specifically CBT type stuff, can be very helpful, because if they're very much aligned that way themselves, the teaching on how to help yourself and help yourself to align with your neighbors through something like
cognitive
behavioral
if
therapy
I was
is
ever
helpful.
going to get therapy, I personally would have a hard time stomaching anybody who wasn't a confessional Lutheran. I'll just even that narrow for me would be hard because, I read some of these other Christian therapists and their theological disposition about what it can accomplish in sanctification and stuff
and sin
is so bad that
and
I just
specifically
couldn't
their
do it.
doctrine of sin.
Their doctrine of sin, their doctrine of sanctification, just bad.
The big elephant in the room, like I said, was the theology of glory. So take like what Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must take up his cross and follow me. Now, let me just put that in modern theological language, psychological language for a second. If anyone would come after me, he must endure the same trauma that I'm about to endure. So in other words, it's so alien, the theology of the cross, that Christians themselves have, because we're part of the culture, right? We live in the culture, we're affected by the culture. What we're after a lot of times in therapy, and this is what I would try to do in my spiritual care, is I would try to help as the pastor, when I would counsel people, them to first see that what they actually want for their life is unreasonable. Because what they actually want is a life free of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
So that's the first step. It's just like deprogramming or getting the theology of glory to just have a light shined on it. Like what you want is heaven on earth now. You're not going to get it. You're going to have to start. And then going to the deeper theology of the cross, which is, and for the sake of the name, you've actually been called to suffer at times, and God does, not because God's a sadomasochist or anything, but because that's the cost of discipleship at times. And it's not a way to win your salvation, but it's the way we love our neighbors is it takes sacrifice at times.
People need to hear that even like about simple, I guess not simple, but decisions and sort of actions that they take in life, like getting married. I could never believe the number of young people I talked to that thought they were getting married because they love this person and that means they're always going to be happy. And here I'd come along and say, well, marriage is mostly struggle. Marriage is about, I'm not going to put a percentage to it, but it's mostly struggle with significant amount of times of just existing together. And then very, very good times where everything's really aligned and you're very happy and you're experiencing joy together.
Well, and it's also a psychological social sciences invasion of marriage that it is purely like a compatriot sort of experiment in caring for each other, where the means of children is something that you might choose to do if it fulfills both of you personally. So the ends of marriage is no longer children.
Yeah, and Jim Nestigan used to call it two sinners trying to live belly to belly together naked for the rest of their lives. And it's like, that's what it is. So, and that's a bit, I think, of, shining a light on the theology of glory a little bit, and a very practical thing and most of these people that I've heard talk about marriage this way are Christian. They're Christian. I didn't know a whole lot of non-Christian young adults.
Are people getting married so they can totally dedicate themselves as Christ did to the church to die for their spouse, which is why Paul is always a little bit nervous about marriage because they evolve into idolatry really quickly.
He's a little skeptical.
Or they'd
of
be
it.
like, well, this person will make my life better. They're here to serve me. That's how most people enter into marriage. I'll be so happy with this person.
I think Paul's skepticism regarding marriage is kind of wonderful sometimes.
There's a theory, I'm sure Bruce knows about it.
I'm not sure about that.
That Paul left Bruce, you've seen a theory that Paul left a wife when he converted to Christianity?
I have heard this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, when he became
a non-converting wife that he abandoned her, and
but he gives advice not to do that.
Yeah, well, maybe
he gives advice not to kill people too.
Maybe he's preaching against himself. I mean,
fair enough.
I don't actually believe that he had a wife, but there are people.
But he specifically gives advice not to do that.
Yeah,
that's kind of fun.
But I would just say, if people, last thing I would have to say is just from my pastoral experiences, if people are struggling from mental health issues, the one thing they shouldn't feel is that God is disappointed with them or is upset with them or doesn't love them. One of my favorite stories about this in Scripture is, Elijah calls down fire on the mountain and destroys the hundreds of priests of Baal. And then the very next passage, Jezebel's out to kill him, and he flees for his life. And while he's out there, he says, It is enough, O Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers. I mean, if that's not a sign of clinical depression in Scripture, I don't know what is. An angel comes and ministers to him, and then again, an angel comes and ministers to him. And of course, there's this, what's the one by the brook, Ezekiel by the brook. There's many passages of saints who entered what we would now call a sort of depression or an anxious state, and God didn't get angry with them and destroy them. He cared for them, and I just think it's important for people to hear that God.
Yeah,
Luther famously struggled with desperate feelings.
Yeah,
God who gave His Son for you isn't angry at you because you've been affected by this. Or
specifically, you're not a worse sinner or less redeemable sinner or somebody who
or less faithful
or somebody who the absolution hasn't taken place in, because the person to the right of you in the pew doesn't have the anxiety or the depression
that you do.
And so I think that would be where sort of the inward, like your inwardness, the voice inside of you is incorrect, and that it is fighting against you. But ultimately, this is why God brings His revelation from outside of you, because whether that person to your right is depressed or anxious or not, they also have a voice that's lying to them, maybe about how good their life is or how triumphant they are, and that temptation, that inward voice of sin, that is incorrect for all people. It is not just those struggling with diagnosed psychological illness.
Is it fair to say, I mean, as we sort of cap this up, you may or may not need a counselor or some counseling help, but I know you need a preacher?
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
For sure. Yeah. No, I think that's good. And and just, I think, be wary of the other sort of religious forces at work, both in the culture and this. This
is a great piece of advice to make sure that if you're getting counseling, that the person that's trying to help you shares the same view as you.
Serpents.
Yeah, faith comes by hearing, and attacks on the faith come by hearing, and a therapist has really good access to your ears. And so I would, vet that whatever you're getting there isn't an attack on the ears, because that is where the devil chooses to attack, because that's where faith comes in. And so, that would be my last piece of word. So,
all right.
You guys happy with this? Scary episode to do. You just don't want to lose friends over this kind of stuff. So, well, guys, thank you for listening to this episode of Thinking Fellows podcast. We hope it's been a helpful, meaningful conversation for you to listen to. If you've been impacted by the Thinking Fellows, or you think it's something, a worthwhile part of your week every week, and you would like to support what we do, you can go to 1517.org/donate at the top of the show notes. If you are a new listener and you'd like to explore more from 1517, you can go to 1517.org. There we have daily blogs, daily podcasts, weekly videos, academies, conferences, a whole lot. There's a lot to explore there. And if you're looking for another audio program to listen to this week, we have another 18 shows to select from.
And someday the other show I'm on will show up on our podcast.
One day.
One day.
So thank you for listening to this episode. We will catch you next time. Bye.